Today is June 6th. We are at the studio of Joe Mazur. My name is Cyrus Burt, and today's production crew is on video camera Soren Whitehouse, on audio recorder Logan McKay, and on still camera Alex Connor.
Yeah, that's good.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about your background.
Sure.
Have you always lived in Marlboro, or did you move here from somewhere else?
Oh, I moved here from someplace else. I was born in the Bronx, in New York, and I lived there till I was about 16, then went to college, and I lived in Paris. I lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and then came to Marlboro in 1972. And I've been here ever since.
What are your parents' names and what were their careers?
My father's name was Abraham Mazur. My mother's was Louise Mazur, but her maiden name was a very interesting German name, Bigeleisen. And my mother's career was actually, she owned a couple of, and managed a couple of antique shops in New York. And my father was a printer. Worked for a printing company. He wasn't a printer himself, but he worked for a company that did things for Bell Labs, so it was kind of classified information that was that he had to deal with.
How would you?
It was government run, so yeah.
How would you describe yourself when you were a child?
How would I describe myself when I was a child? That's a very good question. You know, as a child, I grew up in a very dense neighborhood of the Bronx, and so there was a lot of activity, a lot of street activity. So it's not like rural Vermont in any way. Each day there would be, when I came home from school, there would be, I would do some homework, but most of the days, if it were a day like today, which is a beautiful day, there would be people on the street, and I would go out and play stickball or whatever it is, and there were all sorts of games that we'd play. We would play cards or ball games, but it was always on the street. And even if it was winter, we would just that kind of thing. But it was a lot of street activity. When it came to sports, like stickball, I wasn't really that good at stickball. For some reason, most of the kids in the neighborhood were much better than me. And so, I was kind of like, I wasn't the last guy picked, but I was somewhere there near the, beyond the median guy. And so, it was a little bit of an embarrassment to be a kid and being picked, let's say, out of 12 kids being picked 9th. And so, so I really felt a little bit of that kind of, I had a little inferiority complex that I must admit that was there. That changed, of course, when I grew older, but as a kid, if you think of me as something less than 12 years old, I was kind of really, not the most secure kid in the neighborhood. Let's put it that way. That's just putting it mildly, really.
Where specifically in town do you live, and what is your physical home address?
In town in Marlboro? Physically, it's 161 Fern Hill Road, and this is the road that comes up and it meets two other houses here, and one of them is a little bit further up the road, and one's a little bit before you make this last turn on the road. So that's my physical address.
What are some of the reasons why you moved to Marlboro?
Some really good reasons. First, the number one reason, somewhat number one, is that I had an offer for a job here at Marlboro College. So I came really to replace somebody for 1 year at Marlboro College. And my wife and I, my wife was pregnant with my first daughter, and we felt, it would be nice to spend a year in a nice little rural place in Vermont. I always loved Vermont, and I wanted to spend some time in Vermont. But when we came, I came first. My wife didn't come. I came for a visit and an interview, and I wasn't quite sure because I had another offer someplace else, and I wasn't quite sure. But on the way back after the interview, first I wasn't sure that I had the job, but on the way back, I stopped at the inn in town. You know this inn in town? I stopped at the inn, and as I was driving by the inn, I saw the innkeeper sweeping his front stoop. And I thought, hey, I'm going to just stop and just chat to somebody who lives in the town. Rather, you know, if I'm going to live in Marlboro, or if I'm going to even be here for a year, I want to know what these people are like. You know, what are these people in Marlboro like? I mean, could they be people that I want to live with, or maybe neighbors that I really might not want to be with? So I stopped and I talked to him, this man. His name is Hubert Moore, and he owned the inn. He and his wife ran the inn for many years before I came here. And he charmed me so much that I felt, this is a guy, if he's going to be a neighbor, I expect others would be like him who would be neighbors. And so I felt, this would be great. This is a great town to be in for a year. But I never thought I'd be here more than a year. And then at the end of the year, the job opened up for a full, I guess you would call it, lifetime position if I would pass the muster with the college in a few years, and I would have it for a longer period of time. So that's how it all happened. I mean, it was just the first year. I loved it here for the year, and I did want a job for a longer period, and it just opened up, and I was just blessed to get it. So that's in a nutshell, that's the answer. Now, let me ask you a question. But I know I'm being filmed at the moment, but let me ask you a question. Do you want me to continue with the answer? Because I can talk to you all day long. So if you want me to continue, or do you want me to sort of break these answers into smaller segments that you feel like, if you feel that I'm going on too long for an answer, just give me a signal.
It's fine. It's actually answering multiple questions I have, so it's actually quite helpful.
Okay, great. Just so you know, I don't mind stopping anywhere, but I can go on forever.
How many brothers or sisters do you have, and what are their names?
I have one brother, and his name is Barry. Same last name as me, Mazur. He's my biological brother. He's 4 years older than I am. No sisters, just one brother.
Where does he live now?
He lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
What high school did you go to?
I went to DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. It was a big high school. I mean, your school, well, your school here is minuscule compared to that. I mean, it'd be like it would fit in a broom closet in my high school. So I can't even remember how many people were in my high school, but it's in the thousands, many thousands. So that would have been my high school. We got
Should we
equipment.
stop or?
Yeah.
Okay.
I decided to bring both lights because you're right about the sun.
Well, we could close the doors too.
No, this will be good.
Okay.
You can set that up. You don't have to wait for me to do it. It's fine.
I don't really know
It's 'cause you're
how.
in 8th grade, Logie. But you know how to set that up, would you? Alex, would you see if the cube, the orange cube, is in that bag? The big bag. It's a pretty nice light though, isn't it? I like how I'm looking at the screen. I like how you have that set up. Thank you.
It's very natural.
What, Logan?
I don't know what's up with this.
up with it?
He's not moving down. Oh. I was doing the wrong one.
No, we won't. We just want pulling it down. Look what it wants to do. What about that one over there, where Soren is?
Oh, hi.
And I'll put this one here.
That's how it can go.
Well, we'll have to mess with that a little bit. And you can plug in here.
Hopefully that didn't mess up the audio.
It probably stopped because I just unplugged it.
Well, I paused it before I started.
Oh, okay. This is a pro organization here, Joe.
I can see that. I can see that.
Who's that?
You know, I had an interview with CBS last month, so that was. You're doing better than they.
Well, you know, I got these lights because this fall PBS came to interview Michelle, and they had these LED lights, and they are really magic.
They're nice.
So easy to use.
Are these books you've read?
Yep.
Yeah, let's have this one over here.
Yep.
And let's maybe try to figure it out so we can not trip. Sorry, would you get that back here? Why don't you go that way, Logan? And hopefully that will. Yes, I was talking to somebody today who said they heard your interview with, I think it was maybe in Vermont. Who talked to?
Well, I had 40 interviews for this one book. No, that's not true. No, it was 2 different books. So there's 12 interviews for this one book. So I don't know which one it is.
Well, it's a name I know.
It wasn't Jane Lindholm.
This who.
Yeah,
I
she's
heard,
the Vermont.
Yeah, I heard part of that one.
Oh, you heard?
Yeah, that was really
good,
interesting.
good. Yeah, that was great. You know how they tell you that when you hear Vermont Public Radio, they list all of the different studios that they have.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's one in Brattleboro, right? There's one in Brattle, one in Rutland, one, you know, they're all over Bennington. You know?
Yeah.
All these studios that they all have. It turns out that I went to the studio in Brattleboro. Studio in Brattleboro is it's a little closet in the Marlboro College kind of you know, an alcove of Marlboro College, and then you go into the room. It's a storeroom, and then inside that is a booth.
Little sound room.
It's about as big as where that alcove is. And it's about 120 degrees in there because nobody ever opens the door, and it's black. And it's soundproof.
Right.
It's insulated. And you're sweating in there. There's nobody there. You just have to get somebody to open the key, and then somehow you put on headphones and you're connected. You're on. This is the big studio, the Vermont Public Radio studio in Brattleboro.
Now, Joe, would you look at Cyrus and sort of have your head the way you're going to be when you're talking with Cyrus?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That okay? Okay.
Mostly, I'm trying to figure out, Soren, if we can. The lights shining off his eyeglasses.
Oh,
or
yeah.
something.
Oh, I could take my glasses off.
No. Well,
I think that's mostly the windows.
mostly
from
windows.
outside.
Okay.
I think
Alright.
so. And the 2 lights, you can see them, but it's not like obscuring his eyes.
Okay. All right.
Is that
You guys good?
I think so.
Okay. Do we have a do-over from the
lights
last?
No,
one?
we'll just pick up.
Okay.
All right.
I don't know if it's
You know, it was funny with the PBS thing because the sound guy was just going ballistic with Route 9.
Oh God.
And so the interviewer would ask Michelle a question, and the answer would be like 5-10 minutes long, and like 7 minutes into it, a truck would go by.
Oh.
he'd shut it down, say, okay, would you do that again?
Yeah, I can imagine.
Do that again? I don't know what I just said.
And
Right,
then
yeah.
the word.
Right, yeah, yeah. It was pretty amusing.
Should I use your bathroom?
Okay.
Sorry?
Should I use your bathroom?
Yeah,
I'll
you
take
go up
her.
in the
I'll take
house.
her.
Yeah. It's when you come in the front door, it's right on your left.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Are you ready, Logan?
Yeah.
Okay. Are you recording?
Yep.
What did you do during the summer between high school and going to college?
I worked for my uncle. My uncle had a screen. He had a silk screening business. I don't know. You know what silk screening is?
It's a kind of art,
Yeah, it's art.
isn't it?
Yeah, but his was commercial. So they would roll out, I'll give you one example. There would be these sheets of, sometimes it was paper, sometimes it was kind of a thin tin. And there would be these squeegees of rubber that would go by, and they'd put colored paint in the screen. And then somebody would not mechanically, there was somebody actually with a fist, and push this rubber thing across the screen, and the ink would be pushed through a screen, and out would come a picture of something. And the particular thing I'm thinking of was Pepsi Cola cans.
Oh.
So you know how cans. Well, if you take apart a can, a Pepsi Cola can, and you unravel it, it's almost like aluminum foil. It's so thin, but when you close it up and you seal it, it's very strong.
Because it's a cylinder.
It makes the cylinder, and then you have the cap, the top and bottom, and it's very strong. And this was kind of, it felt like this. You pick it up, and it was almost like this. I'm exaggerating a little bit. It was a little stiffer than this, but I'm saying this, and the camera's probably not on it, but it's almost like paper. And so I worked in this little place that had about 15 people working in it. And I did that for a very short time because I couldn't stand the job. And I just was there maybe 3-4 weeks, and then I quit. And I think I worked in the Bronx Zoo for a short time selling ice cream. And that was it. And that was that summer, I think. Pretty close to that summer, anyhow.
Would you describe yourself differently as a teenager than when you were a child?
No, I don't think so. As a teenager, I was pretty much the same. If you ask me the question of would I describe myself differently as let's say a post-teenager, somewhere, when I was going to college as opposed to when I was going to high school, yes, very different. Then it was a total shift in the way I behaved and the way I was, I think. So there's a big, big difference then. But not from being, when you say child, I would imagine you're thinking 9-year-old to 12-year-old, or 9-year-old to 14-year-old. I don't think there was much difference. I mean, yes, there's certain, you go through puberty and you get a little bit, there's a point where, the friendships are a bit different because you've changed friendships. And I moved around a lot as a teenager, so my parents moved from New York to New Jersey for a short time. So that changed the people I hung out with, and so there was a difference there because, you are somewhat, I think, anyhow, I was, you're somewhat tuned to your friendships. In other words, you change with different friendships because, there are different people who influence you. So there's a kind of a change there. And when I moved to New Jersey instead of New York, there's also already a slightly different culture there. So there was a change, I think, a little bit. But not significant. Not as significant as there would have been a change when I, from 14 to 18.
May I ask how old you are now?
I'm 74.
What is your partner's name?
My what?
Partner's name.
My partner. My wife, her name is Jennifer. her name now is Mazur. She changed her name because in the year we got married, which was 1971, it was not easy for a woman to keep her maiden name. You probably don't know this, but in those years, it wasn't easy for a woman to keep her maiden name. You could do it, but you had to go through the courts. You had to, it was an expense, you had to get a lawyer, you had to go through to a judge, and the judge would either grant it or not grant it, and there was a lot of restrictions on changing a name. Her name originally was Jennifer Joffe, so she had a really kind of a sweet ringing name. I wish she had kept it because it's such a, I think it's a very beautiful name. But she couldn't keep it without a lot of problems. It was a forced thing. I mean, you think that you guys, it's hard for you to imagine, for example, 1971 is a pretty progressive time, but when my mother came to this country very early on in her career, women didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't even vote. So, to not be able to keep your own name when you get married is not the same, but after all, there is a problem with that. I mean, you're suggesting that women don't have the same rights as men. But of course, men keep their names anyhow. It's not like they would change their name. If they wanted to change their name, they also have to go through courts to do that. And they still do.
Where is she from?
She's from Holyoke, Massachusetts, not far from here.
How did you two meet?
Ah, good question. We met at what's called a moratorium. It was a march against the Vietnam War. In the 60s, there was a war. Americans were being shipped over to fight in Vietnam, and we were protesting it. And we had a march from Cambridge to the Boston Common in 1960, well, it must have been 69. And there was what's called a moratorium. 100,000 people marched in this march. And at the end of the march, we all came into the Boston Common, which is, you may know this, but it's a big park in the middle of Boston. And people were speaking in the park, and I just happened to be standing near this young woman who was sitting down with her friends, and she marched in from Brandeis, another university, and I was coming from Cambridge, and we happened to sit or be very close to each other, and that's how we really met. I mean, the story's longer than that, but you may not want to hear the whole story.
What career has she been involved with?
What career? She originally worked at what's called a home base teacher. She would go to the homes of children who were handicapped, mostly handicapped, and help the parents to understand their children and help them educate their children, because they would have to. Most of those children were educated either at home, or in a center, or in other ways. But it was really mostly to help the parents understand the disabilities of these children. And she would drive from town to town and from Marlboro, all over the place. I think within a 50-mile radius, and she would go almost daily to different homes all over the state, well, at least this region of the state, Windham County, I think, and sometimes Bennington County, and that's what she did for many years. And then she changed. At some point, we were away for 3 years. I had a sabbatical and a leave, and she had a position in the Bronx. We were living in Greenwich, Connecticut for a short time, and she had a position there, and when she came back, she changed jobs, and she decided, well, she got a position to become the director of a clinic for children who needed some mental health, who had mental health issues. So she went from handicap, that would be physically handicapped, to children who had mental health issues.
What are your children's names?
My oldest child is, her name is Catherine. Now her last name is Mazur Jeffries, so she's married. And my youngest, her name is Tamina Marshall. She lives in Brattleboro, and she has 2 daughters. My oldest has 2 daughters who are identical twins, and then a son who's a bit younger.
What are your grandchildren's names?
Okay, my grandchildren, starting with the oldest, Sophie, and so that would be Sophie Jeffries. Her twin, who's something like 6 minutes younger than she, is Yelena, spelled with a Y, so Y-E-L-N, Y-E-L-E-N-A, and then the next youngest is Lena, and she's 9. She's the one who lives in Brattleboro. She's one who lives in Brattleboro. The next youngest would be also my daughter Catherine's son. He's 8, or about 8.5, and his name is Ned, or actually his real name is Edward, but we call him Ned. And then the next one, so that we're up to 5 now, and the next one is 18 months, and her name is Athena, like the goddess.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about your working life as a writer and about your teaching life.
Okay.
So we'll start with the working life questions. When did you realize that you wanted to work as a writer?
I've always wanted to be a writer, actually. In some sense, I always wanted to be a whole load of things. But there are certain talents you can have, and certain you just, you wish you had. But I've always been writing, not for publication. I used to write poetry in college, and I wrote quite a bit of poetry in college, and sometimes I'd write some short stories, and took some. I never took a real writing class. I took a lot of great books classes. In other words, to read books. I took a class on the short story, which I really loved very much. I think that was really good. It influenced me somewhat, but I felt that my career was really somewhat more in math and science. So I didn't take the writing as a career kind of thing. I just like to do it, like I do piano now. I'm never going to be a pianist. I'm never going to be a musician, but it's something you just like to do. And so I've always done quite a bit of writing. I wrote the most significantly long thing that I've ever done in my life was a thing that I did for both my children as a Christmas present back in 1981. They were young. They were, they're 4 and 8 or something like that. And every night when they went to bed, I would write just a couple of pages of a long story about what it was like when I was their age. And I would do this now this is 81, no computers. So you had to do this on typewriter. If you made a mistake, you had to backspace, sometimes you had a little whiteout, it was called whiteout, a little white ink, and with a little brush in it, you sort of white it out and go back, and forward, you know. There was no spell check or nothing like that. It was just everything was very hard. You know that, right? You've heard this before. But so I would do this every night, almost every night, for almost a year. And, you know, I ended up with like 400 typewritten pages of this, it was a manuscript of what it was like from the time I was about, I think about 4 years old to 12, or maybe something like that. And so, and then I called it the Little Joey book. My name is Joe. And I called it Little Joey book, and they still have it. It's, you know, I bound it up and gave them this as a Christmas present. So that was the most significant thing I ever did in terms of writing those years. And then I've always written class notes for my students, so sometimes the class notes would take reams of paper. I mean, it wasn't just, you know, one single thing. I mean, there were a couple of classes that I would write notes for, you know, every night for a while, and they grow into a nice pack of material. When I retired, though, I felt what I really wanted to do was to write something about how I came to study mathematics. And so I wrote a manuscript, and I didn't know what to do with the manuscript, and I thought, I wasn't writing it really for publication. And then one day I just ran into somebody who said, hey, you know, I just published this manuscript, and I can give you the address of this agent if you like, and send your document, your piece to this agent, see what he thinks. So I did. I sent this to the agent, and the agent said, gee, you know, I love this thing. I love your writing. I love it. But, there's a but. I knew there was going to be a but. The but was, you know, I don't know how to pitch it to any publisher. I just don't. It was a very good agent, by the way. He was a well-known agent. If I had gotten him, it would have been really terrific. But he said, but here's the name of another agent. He might be interested in it. So I did the same. I sent him the material. I sent the new agent the material. And he said exactly the same thing. He said, I don't know how to pitch this. This is unique, you know, this is a genre of writing I don't know anything about. I don't know how to pitch it. I don't know if any publisher really knows what this is really about. So I thought, okay. And then I just, almost out of the blue, there was a little less than the blue, but it was out of, with almost randomly, I picked a publisher. A small house. It was actually, it was a big house. It was really quite big. I didn't know it was big, but it was, and I just sent this email, a query, and a few chapters, just a few chapters of my manuscript to this publisher, not an agent, just a publisher. And the guy said, right away, it was almost immediately, like within 2 days, he said, I love it, let's do it. That's how it happened. And that was my first book, was Euclid in the Rainforest, which is, that's the cover to the book. It was a fantastic cover. I asked for a cover like that, actually, because it's, you know, I wanted a Rousseau jungle, a jungle scene, where if you look very closely, there are mathematical symbols in it, but you can't see it unless you really keep looking. You have to keep looking, and as you look, you find more and more of them. So I didn't design that cover, that's what I asked for, and that's what they came up with. It's really quite, I've never seen a cover quite as beautiful as that. So that was my first book, and that's how I got into the writing. Once I did the first book, it was, you know, that same publisher wanted another book, and I did another book with that publisher, and then other publishers started to ask me to do books, and that's how it came. I mean, you can't stop after a while, after that.
Was there anyone in particular who encouraged your earliest efforts to become an author?
Yeah, well, that's. I think everybody, every book I ever read, I wanted to duplicate what was in those books. Yeah, in the mathematics books, because all my books are kind of like, they're nonfiction. It's not fiction books, and they're all somewhat science mathematics. At least, that's what I'm known for, and yet there's a lot of narrative in these books. There's no real fiction in the books, but there's a lot of anecdotal stuff. So there's stuff that's more memoir. So a lot of the stuff is about me in the book. So that's why the genre is so difficult to peg down. That kind of writing is really hard to peg. So what I have is the influences would be one person, Ian Stewart, who is a very good friend of mine. He's written about 30 or 40 books, and long before I ever came to writing books. He's very well known. He's a master of science writing. Has written science fiction books, some really best-selling books, in fact. And so he was, I think, a good influence, and there were a number of others, but almost everybody I really read in terms of anything that was dealing with popular mathematics, I loved. There was a book by a man by the name of Tobias Danzig, and he wrote a book that really almost, I could say, influenced a great deal of my going into mathematics, because it was a book that was popular mathematics and science. And the book was called A Number of the Language of Science. And it was out of print for very many years, many years. And when I was, I would say maybe 18 or 20, I read it. And I was really influenced by that book in particular. And when my editor, in a chat with my editor, he asked me that same question you're asking me now. I said, oh yes, well, Number of the Language of Science. And I said, well, it's out of print. And he said, well, it's out of print. Is it that good? If it's that good, let's get it back in print. And he said, would you like me to be the editor of it? And I said, sure. And so I became the editor of this other book, which was really one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And so we edited. I don't have a copy here, but I have copies of it in my house. I don't keep those copies here. I keep the ones that I really want to browse for my work here. But that's a great book.
You've published a number of books about math and math history. Would you briefly describe each of them in chronological order?
In chronological order, okay. I just the one that's called Euclid in the Rainforest actually does take place in the rainforest. The title, I really didn't have a good title originally, and it was a memoir about how I first came to really appreciate mathematics. I was actually in a kind of a crash landing in a plane that landed in Venezuela, and it was a storm. It was a really stormy night, and in this plane trip, I was coming from Aruba, and the plane actually landed in a lot of water. Not real water. I mean, it wasn't the ocean, but it was essentially a crash landing, and a lot of people got, the plane was waterlogged. It was up to the water in the wheels, so the belly was in the water, and so there was a guy on board who didn't bother him at all, and so we got to talking, and he was a bit of a crazy guy, but he was a mathematician, he studied mathematics, and he had no plan to go anywhere, and he sort of tagged along with me, and we were hitchhiking. We hitchhiked through the Venezuelan jungle, actually, And the only people who were going through the Venezuelan jungle at the time, this goes back to 1959, I think. It's very primitive outside of Caracas. Caracas is a big city, but once you get outside, it's extremely primitive. You know, there are mud huts there. And the only thing going on these roads, which are pretty much dirt roads, much worse than the dirt roads here in Marlboro, they get washed out all the time, was the army. So the Venezuelan army they have their convoys going into different, there are cities, small towns and small cities close to the Orinoco River, much more inland. And so we decided we were going to, I had a plan actually. It was a kind of, I read a book on anthropology and I thought I wanted to be an anthropologist. So I started to hitchhike into the jungle to see some sites that I wanted to see. And the army picked us up. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And so we went for an overnight trip with the army. And this is where the whole thing began. The book really begins there. And so you wonder how that could be mathematics, but it's all in the rainforest. It happens in the rainforest. The original title was not that, and it was a kind of a pretty wishy-washy title. It wasn't a good title, and then my wife read it, and she said, you know, this is such a beautiful thing. You can't have a title like that. It's got to be something like Euclid in the Rainforest, and that's how that title came about. So that's that book, and it's really a memoir of how it began. The next book was, well, the book I edited, which was Number the Language of Science. Then the next book after that was a book on motion. I got very interested in you know, what motion is, and so I started to write about motion, published that book. It's a book on what motion is. And then I wrote a book on, what was the next one? The next one was on gambling. Book on the mathematics of gambling, and the psychology and the history of gambling. So it starts out with the history of, how did it all start? How did gambling start? How did humans start to gamble? So it was a book on gambling. Then the next one was a book on symbols. And that had a curious beginning. Yeah, that's that book, that cover there. That had a curious beginning because I was at a writers' conference, and a lot of these things start at writers' conferences. I was at a writers' conference, and some evenings we would go down to a wine bar and we'd drink a bit of wine and we'd get a little bit, not really tipsy, but a little tipsy, and we'd start to joke around. And then some people asked this question, how did music symbols begin? Where did they come from? You know, that question. It's a simple question. How did it begin? Couldn't have been there forever, right? So the musician was there, and the musician said, I'll tell you. And he told. Then a psychologist asked this question: How did math symbols begin? And I really didn't know, actually. I mean, I knew somewhat. I said, I don't really know, but I bet it's no earlier than the 16th century. And everybody said, what? 16th century? What about the Greeks? What about Euclid and all of those? It had to be before the 16th century. It turns out it is not. And I was really surprised that when I started to look this up, I realized, wow, how did they do mathematics? How did they do mathematics from the 16th century? Well, the answer is they wrote it out, like you talking. It was rhetoric. They would just talk it out and say, if you wanted to say the square root of 2, you wouldn't say the square root of 2. You wouldn't say something like that. You would say the square root of 2, and it would type it out. Or you wouldn't type it out, but you would actually write it out. So everything is written out. There was no symbol. There was literally no symbols before the 16th century. So that surprised me, and then I decided to write a book on it. and that book was a big surprise. A lot of people were just dumbfounded by the fact that, wow, you have to write mathematics as if you're talking.
Sorry.
And then after that, let's see.
I have a question.
Thanks.
How did they come up with what to call symbols like square root and multiplication?
People invented it. Mathematicians. I'll give you an example. The equal sign. Okay, that's one that you know, right? You think, hey, equals, it have to be around forever. How do you write equals? Well, the guy who invented the equal sign, a man by the name of Robert Record with an E on the, a silent E at the end of his name, Record with an E. And this goes back to really the 16th century. He was writing, a manuscript with about, almost 300-page manuscript. And by page 200, he writes, he was writing in Latin, so he would say, you know, I've written equalis, because he'd say the word, equals, that's how he'd do it, right? I've written equalis so many times, why don't I just symbolize that word and write 2 long dashes? And they were kind of like 2 lines, but they were long. I mean, maybe this, you would write something like this size. He wrote, and then you had something on this side of the lines and something on this side of the line. He would say, that means equals. It means this is equal to that. Right? So, and then he writes in the book, why am I so stupid to write this so many times? Why don't I just put the symbol in? And then from 200 to 300, he's using the word, using the symbol, the equal sign. So, okay, so that's how they come. And people realize, why do we use words? We don't need the words. And so they start to compress things. And with symbols, you are mentally changing the way you're thinking of mathematics. You're thinking a lot differently by using symbols. It becomes much easier, to balance equations and do that. Much easier than talking about this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's how it began. So that was the symbols book, and then the 5th or 6th book, I can't remember now, is this book here, Fluke, and that's about coincidences. And that came about again at a writers' conference in Italy. A woman would come down every morning at breakfast and she would say, hey, last night this incredible coincidence happened to me. I have to tell you about this coincidence. And I would say, okay, tell me about the coincidence.
Or critical acclaim.
Well, the first book had really great critical acclaim. And they all have, actually, but this one was very significant. I think it was on April 1st, I had come back from a trip, and on April 1st I had came back, and on the answering machine was a voice of somebody I didn't know, but somebody who said, I had just been selected, my book, Euclid in the Rainforest, was just selected to be Pan America's, an award from Pan America, a significant award. But it didn't win the award, but it was one of 2 finalists for the award. And that was significant. Anyhow, the finalist was significant. And then I realized, hey, wait, when I heard the message, I realized, hey, it's April 1st. So I thought somebody was playing a joke on me. Sure enough, I called the person, and it wasn't a joke. So it was quite significant. That was great. And then, there's a lot of fellowships that I got as a result of writing these books. I got quite a few fellowships from different foundations. And those were vindicating a lot of my work, suggesting that I was doing good work. That's all. So yeah, that's the best I can answer.
Have you ever written poetry or fiction for publication, or have you concentrated mostly on work?
Not for publication, as I said earlier on. I used to write poetry when I was in college. We had a few people who would get together and write some public poetry. I would write it, trying to hone my more of my prose writing skills to write the poetry. And so I would write little short stories, 2 or 3 page stories. And in order to get the sounds really right for the stories, I tried to write them poetically first. Not the whole story, but just poems about the story. So I did a lot of that when I was younger. And then more recently, when I was about, I guess it goes back about 12 years, maybe 10 years ago. It must be 10 or 12 years ago. I was in Anne Gengorelli's poetry, adult poetry group for about 3 or 4 years. So we'd meet every Thursday night over the winter months. And you know Anne Gengorelli,
Yeah,
right?
she
Still does
poetry.
poetry, yeah. So she had an adult group, and I was in it for about 4 years, I guess. And that was, again, my doing poetry, but I never did it for publication. I'm not a poet.
Where or with whom did you study writing so that you could gain the skills and abilities to author entire books?
Good question. I never did. I never really did study writing. I mean, I never studied. I've never studied it formally in any way.
What writers are among your favorites, or who you feel have influenced your work most?
Well, the influence of my nonfiction work would have, as I said, Ian Stewart is a really big influence. And Tobias Danzig was a very strong influence there. I think the writing, if I were really to put writing in a bigger category, I would say Herman Melville is one of my real favorite authors of all time. But then, if you think of shorter and more contemporary things, I think it's really hard to peg any particular one at this point.
How many years did it take you to feel that you could call yourself a professional writer? Like when somebody asked you what you did, and you would answer you were a writer first and a mathematics professor
That's an
second.
excellent question. That's a fantastic question. And the reason I'm saying it so enthusiastically is because when I wrote the first book, and even got this significant award for it, several awards in fact for that book, I still couldn't bring myself to say I was a writer. It took a long time, you know, because I was a mathematician for over 30 years before that. So when I would travel, and you know, when you travel to a foreign country, especially if, let's say, I'd go to England or someplace, and the border patrol would ask, you know, what's your profession? And I would always say mathematician, even though I was retired from mathematician, and my wife would say, why don't you say you're a writer? And I say, I just can't bring myself to that point of saying I'm a writer. It's just so much of the feeling of, I guess it comes down to, you know, I know an enormous quantity of mathematics because of teaching for 30 years and being schooled for at least another dozen before that, right? So I knew a lot of mathematics. I know very little. If you ask me, you know, anything, not quite, this isn't quite true because I did teach writing a little bit at Breadloaf, for example. I taught writing. I had a craft class, a couple of craft classes twice at Breadloaf. So I did teach it as craft. But I don't really feel that I have the same bulk of knowledge about writing that I do about mathematics. So that sort of taints my feeling of whether I should be thinking about being a writer or being a mathematician. And still today, now I'm comfortable saying I'm a writer, but I'm still queasy about it. I still say I'm a mathematician first and then a writer.
Why did you make the effort to become a professional writer in the first place?
I didn't make the effort. It just came. I was just writing. As I said, that first manuscript, I wasn't even thinking that it was going to be published. I was not really thinking of it as a career in that sense. I mean, I didn't need it as a career anyhow. It wasn't that I had to do it for monetary reasons. So it was just a matter of luck, I think, to just get this published the first time around. And then as the others came, they just came. I wasn't making any effort. So for example, after my first publisher, which was Dutton was a publisher that's owned by Penguin Press. After that, it was other publishers who came to me. Because those first two books were really very successful, and they really were, sales-wise, they were quite successful. So as the next one, the publisher came to me, and then after that, publishers were coming to me, and then I got an agent. So it was very simple. So I didn't make a real effort. I mean, I surely make an effort to write book proposals. That's an effort, but it wasn't something I really had planned to do.
What would you say are some of the more difficult parts of being a writer?
Finding the time to write. Difficult. I don't find very much of a difficulty in writing. There's not much difficulty. I never have what people call writer's block. When you're dealing with nonfiction, writer's block is not an issue. It's much less of an issue for nonfiction than it is for fiction. If you're writing, I guess, I mean, I'm not a professional writer for nonfiction, so I wouldn't really know that well. But I suspect it happens much more that there are difficulties in writing fiction than nonfiction.
How do you decide what topic you want to write about?
Well, I just told you two. One was in a wine bar, right? It was pretty much decided already for me. The other one was at a writers' conference where this person was telling me coincidences and said you should write a book on coincidences. I didn't want to write that book on coincidences, but somehow I was influenced to do it. Others were how I decided on particular. I have a whole closet filled with questions I still want answered after all these years. I'm 74 years old, I still have these questions. And I have questions I've had since I was a kid, and I still don't know the answers to them. And there's so many things I don't know the answers. And usually I would like to write about something that I want to know the answer to, that I don't know the answer to. And I spend at least a year, sometimes 2 years, just trying to find the answers to these things before I even begin to write. Once I have the answers, then the writing comes easy. The writing just comes. It's not a problem. It's the research that really is, the thing you have to dig into that brings you to where you want to be.
Do you or have you begun writing on a topic and then decide to abandon it?
Not on topics that I've really... Oh, yes. Actually, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes, sometimes you forget these things, right. I think this might take a couple of minutes to tell you this, if you don't mind.
No problem.
Yeah? You're okay with the minutes?
Yeah.
I was invited, it was after Euclid in the Rainforest, just after that came out. I was invited to a high school in the Bronx to give a talk there to 2 classes, and they were reading my book. That was the book that they were supposed to be reading. And I was to go there, and it was a inner city high school, a really tough high school, where there, gang violence, and you have to pass through, you guys don't know these kinds of things, but you have to pass through metal detectors because they have to confiscate your knives and guns and whatever else you bring in. And I had to do the same. I had to go there, I had to go through metal detectors like everybody. Even the teachers have to go through metal detectors. And in most New York City high schools, you have to do that. I think in all of them, public schools, anyhow, you have to do that. And so I went, and I was going to talk about Euclid in the Rainforest, my book, and I was just amazed. It's a really tough school. Plenty of very poor people in that school, and some tough kids. Lots of fooling around in the classroom. But when I got in there, and this teacher was really good in disciplining, and keeping the students from just, throwing things around. The kids were, everybody in the class was really into it. They had great questions. I had somewhat good answers. They had terrific questions. And then I came home, and they wrote, the teacher, of course, instructed them to write to me. And they wrote me these wonderful little letters. Thank you for coming, I was aghast, some of these guys are in gangs, So I thought, I want to write about this class. I was going to write about the class. So I thought, I'm going to ask this teacher, can I sit in on the class? I'll come down once a month for, a couple of days, and I will listen in on the class, and I will write about the class. I'll write a little book or something, maybe an article. Because I do write a lot of articles, too. I don't just write books. I write magazine articles and that sort of thing. So I came, so I asked the teacher what she thought, and she said, hey, it's great idea, come. But you have to do an awful lot of proposal work to the city of New York to be able to sit in a class like that, to do any kind of work, and the principal had to be behind it. Principal was not behind it. She didn't want to do anything, and she had somebody else come to another class there, and this guy wrote all sorts of bad things about the high school, and she didn't want that, so she nixed it. She said, no, you can't do it. So I said to the teacher, are there 3 or 4 students who would like to come come to a pizza parlor some blocks away, and I would give them these little tiny recorders, and they would just record things that they were in class, and they would just record it, and they would send directly to my computer from their little recorders, what they had to say. And they had the trick was they had to do it at least once a week. They would have to tell me something about what was going on in class. And these 4 kids agreed. 4 people agreed. We went to a pizza parlor and we had this great session of pizza. And I gave each one of them a little recorder. And only one person really continued. In first week, I got a few files back. They just emailed the files back right to my computer. And the next week, only one. And this one young woman, and decided to do this. And it turned out that it was going to be nonfiction. And then I sent it to my editor, and the editor said she loved it, but she said no. Some higher ups in the publishing firm didn't think it was going to sell, so I decided to make it into nonfiction. And I fictionalized it. I decided to fictionalize it, rather. And I fictionalized it, and I wrote it about it in a fictional sense. and it was all about her as the main character. And there was a romance in it. There was all sorts of things. And she was in on it. I mean, she was really happy to do this. I'm still good friends with her. She's now doing movies, actually. She's a movie producer. She's terrific. And she came out of this really tough school. And so that's one of the things I've shelved for the moment. I wrote the whole thing. I mean, it's about 400 pages of this book. But it still needs a lot of work. And you know, as I say, I have a day job, which is to do nonfiction work. So that's still in my desk drawer. So that's one thing that I did put down. And I will come back to it, but that's one thing I would put down.
Have you ever felt discouraged and considered stopping your efforts at writing?
No. never have. If you say, have I ever felt discouraged about other things, then the answer is yes, of course. You know, you can get discouraged by a lot of things, but no, not by writing.
Would you please describe a typical day when you write? Do you have certain routines or places that help you to write?
Yes, actually, most of the year I do not write in this cabin. It's very inspirational here, but sometimes I need to be near the internet, for example. You know, there's no internet here, so I work most of the day in the upstairs of my house, and if I don't get something done pretty much in the morning, and if I'm sort of sidetracked by something else for a long time, it's really hard for me to get into writing in the late afternoon. Because the late afternoon is when I exercise and do all sorts of things. I can't mix times up. I also am a kind of person who I never could do two things at the same time. You know, I'm not a multitasker. So my mind has to be really concentrated on the writing. And if I'm trying to do two things, like write two different things, like if I'm going to write a non-fiction thing and a fiction thing, I couldn't do that. So that's why I have to put one in the desk drawer and the other work on. So I can't do that. So I do have to be somewhat regimental about my writing, where I'm going to write, what hours I'm going to write. And if I miss those opportunities, then I say, well, I'll do that tomorrow. I mean, I do have deadlines, so I really have to finish things by deadlines. I've never really gone over a deadline, but most writers do. You know, publishers don't really pay attention to deadlines, and neither do writers. But I do, though.
Cyrus, you have 10 minutes?
How many more?
10.
Oh, okay. Let's see. Most of these were already answered, so... what are some of the places you've read that you felt were important to you?
Places I went?
Pieces you have read.
Oh, pieces. Pieces of information? No, pieces that I've read. Well, I think almost everything I read is important to me. I mean, you know, and I can't say that I take away it consciously. Most of the things I read, you know, you don't take away it consciously. You take it into the subconscious, and that has an effect on you. I read a lot of. Most of my reading is New York Review of Books, and I read a lot of book reviews. And that doesn't mean I read the books. I read the book reviews a lot. And those book reviews in that particular publication gives me a lot of hints as to, you know, what is interesting in the world. And so I get a lot of it from that. I get a lot of it from reading New Yorker magazine. I don't really read newspapers for the sake of reading newspapers. I mean, you know, if I'm interested in some particular thing in the paper, I'll read it. But I don't. I spend about half an hour every morning reading pieces of the New York Times, but I can't say I really read the New York Times. Those pieces of things that I read constantly, you know what I do is I like to take hot baths every once in a while. If I do a lot of exercise, I take a hot bath, and I take my my stuff into the bathtub, and I'll take an hour and read it in the bathtub. It's just, and sometimes it gets wet, and sometimes it doesn't. But most of the time, I'm pretty careful about bringing good books into the bathroom.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions about your mathematics.
Oh, good.
Would you begin by explaining what the study of mathematics includes for you personally?
Yeah, that's a good question. What does it include? I find that mathematics is about structure, how things fit together, more than anything else. I mean, you know, it's not so much about manipulating, you know, if you studied algebra, for example, that's a manipulation of symbols, right? So you're manipulating symbols, and you have some question you want answered, you model it by an equation, and then you solve the equation by manipulating things. What's really going on there could be a lot of things. I mean, you see the manipulation of the symbols, but really what's going on is everything has a mirror image in some other field. So for example, when you're doing algebra, I could be doing geometry of the algebra, because everything connects. It's kind of like, if you think of it as a through the looking glass, Alice in Wonderland through the looking glass. If on one side is one thing is happening, the other through the looking glass, the mirror, is something else. Those two are manipulated by, you can actually put strings attached to each one. So the algebraic symbols become geometric objects in geometry. So you have to think, when you're thinking of algebra, when I think of algebra, I'm also thinking of geometry, because the manipulation is also geometric. So I think mathematics not as simply manipulation, but the structure, because the geometry has a structure. The algebra, you can't really see the structure. You know there is a structure, but the geometry, you see the structure. So when I went to, when my graduate work in mathematics is in a field called algebraic geometry, and that is, you have a problem. It looks like it's an algebraic problem because it's stated that way, but then you interpret it geometrically, and that's easier to solve the geometry, and then you get the solution, and you have to interpret that solution back into the algebraic, because that was where the question was asked. And so that's the kind of thing that I used to do, and so it's the way I think. I think in both, categorically I think in terms of algebra, and I also think in terms of geometry at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So let me pause for a second. The camera's running out of battery. Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. How did your interest in mathematics develop?
Read my book, Euclid in the Rainforest. Yeah, somewhat that way. I mean, my brother's a mathematician too, so there was a bit of an influence, a strong influence, I think. I started as an architect. I went to college, my first year was as an architect. I went to architecture school. And somehow I felt at some point that I didn't know enough mathematics. And so I took a junior, it wasn't even, yeah, it was a junior year abroad. It might have even been earlier than junior year abroad in Paris. So I went to Paris, studied mathematics in Paris for a year and a half, actually, more than just a year. And when I came back, I just got a degree in mathematics, and then that's where I was ever since. There was nothing strange about that. At that time, there was nothing strange about it.
You have a doctoral degree in mathematics. Where did you take your degree, and what was the topic of your thesis?
Yeah, I do have a doctorate degree in mathematics from MIT, and my thesis was in what I just talked about, algebraic geometry, which is the confluence of algebra and geometry and how they mirror each other.
Or how?
About to run out of battery, you know that.
I know, I tried the other one, it doesn't work.
How did you become a professor at Marlboro College?
Okay, well, I'm going to repeat.
Oh, right.
Well,
yeah.
maybe don't, because we're
Yeah.
Okay.
running out of time.
Yeah, yeah,
If it's if
Yeah.
it's repeat.
A lot of the things, yeah, I've been talking a long time, and sometimes I go over what his question
that's okay,
is.
Joe. It's good.
And that gives him the answers to questions that are going to come up later.
If you could teach for 1 year at any college or university anywhere in the world, which one do you think you would choose?
Oh my God, what a question! Is this an offer? Gee, that's a great question. I think if I really wanted to do that, I'd probably try something like, I think I'd try something like China or Japan. Yeah, I think that's where I'd want to do it. I mean, you know, all the others I've had some kind of stint at in you know, in the Western world. I really want the Eastern world, something like that.
What have some of your former students gone on to do at Marlboro College?
They've become professors of mathematics, mostly. I have, I think, 3 who are pretty significantly known, probably better known than I am, as professors of mathematics. Some of them are dancers, some are musicians. Yeah, Marlboro is that way, I think. Not everybody sticks to their original. Well, the hummingbird right on your hat.
I can hear it.
Just was on your hat.
What people or experiences would you say have influenced you in your personal life, and in what ways have they influenced you?
Oh, I'll tell you, the biggest influence in my life is my wife. I think significantly. I mean, that every wife is going to be a significant influence, but I think really she has taught me just about everything about how to be human. That's really true.
Is there anything else about your work or your life that you'd like to mention that I haven't asked you about yet?
I think you've covered just about. It was good questioning, really good questioning. So good that I think you really covered all the bases.
Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.